Hi, welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. I think when I was 11 years old, I was in this summer camp. It was called Mini University, and the idea was we did three different majors. Those majors were drama, some kind of science, and law. And for some reason in the drama class, we did this activity where we did tableaus, like dramatic poses. And we did them while a certain song was played. That song was called Paranoid. It's by this band, Black Sabbath. At the time, I had no way of knowing what the song was. I just thought it sounded cool, and I just had this one line and was stuck in my head. Finished with my woman, cause she couldn't help me with my mind. And since that moment so many years ago, I've had a lingering curiosity about Black Sabbath, and that curiosity only grew stronger when I learned that their lead singer was Ozzy Osbourne, who again I just knew as being this kind of famous weird guy. I eventually heard the legend of him and the bat, which to my understanding was an accident. He thought someone had thrown a plastic bat on stage, so he was only weird enough to bite a plastic bat's head off. But anyway, for years I've been intrigued by the idea of Black Sabbath. I've vaguely had the thought of wanting to check out their music. And I was reminded of them a couple years ago when I was reading the book that was kind of the impetus for me starting these series of album reviews. It was David Hepworth's The Rise and Fall of the Rock Stars. And he talked about Black Sabbath's role in rock history as being the band that changed rock music from being that thing that succeeded because it spoke to everyone. It was simple, upbeat, and spoke to universal emotions like love. And suddenly it made rock this niche thing that certain people would think was really cool. Certain people would want to learn guitar, drums, or bass to jam out. But once you get to the Black Sabbath era of rock and roll, suddenly a key part of rock and roll is no longer just the thing they play at the sock hops or the dances or whatever you want to call them for everyone to groove to. Suddenly it became a more specific identity and not for everyone. And that was kind of how I experienced it when I ended up taking the first two Black Sabbath albums out at the library. Their first album is just called Black Sabbath. I do very much like the album art here. And then their second album is Paranoid, the one that includes that wonderful song I remember from drama camp. So another key detail in talking about Black Sabbath is they're considered one of the, if not the first metal band. And I was a bit surprised when I read that, how consistently that term was used. I think of metal as like an extreme genre of rock and roll where like the singing isn't singing, it's just screaming. I guess this is a pejorative, but I think of metal as unlistenable rock and roll. Whereas the little bit of Black Sabbath I knew before listening to these records, I mean, I could see why it's on the hard rock end of things, but I wouldn't have thought of it as capital M metal. So what's interesting about listening to this first Black Sabbath album is then you kind of hear the component pieces of what makes up a musical genre, what makes a musical revolution, because someday this band of Ozzy Osbourne, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Ward just had to decide we have this new fundamentally different kind of thing. All our lyrics are going to contain references to the occult. We're going to play more minor chords than other band. We're just going to turn up the volume on the bass. Like, it's kind of funny. Like, one thinks of music genres as fundamentally different things, yet it's really just tiny little changes to the kinds of rock we heard before. So not too long ago, I listened to Disraeli Gears by Cream for the first time, and it was interesting to hear how just adding a little bit of distortion to old-time blues suddenly makes it sound like a different genre. It turns the sort of simple, folksy music of blues into psychedelic rock. And on a number of the tracks on this Black Sabbath album, it seemed like what they were doing is taking riffs even directly from Cream's Disraeli Gears album and just making them heavier, putting more emphasis on the bass. So suddenly it wasn't blues and it wasn't psychedelic rock. It was this goth rock metal kind of thing. Now, this first album, Black Sabbath, I should point out, it only has 5 tracks on it. So they're all kind of on the long side. And it really feels more like a mood board than an album. The first song being the title track, Black Sabbath. It starts with these haunting bells ringing, and Ozzy Osbourne lets go with these really affecting vocals, but it doesn't sound like a song as such. It doesn't have a melody that, you can really sing along to. And then the rest of the record just sort of sounds like jams with similar themes. So it was just sort of them introducing themselves to the world and saying, hey, we sing songs with this occult flavor to it. One thing that was frustrating for me is given that Ozzy Osbourne is by far the most famous member of this group, it felt like he wasn't there on a lot of this. And while all the songs are credited as being written by all the members of the band, I have the sense from things I read that the bass player, Geezer Butler, another cool name in its own right, was the primary songwriter on these things. So even if Ozzy Osbourne has come to be the most famous member of Black Sabbath, I do feel like they're a bit of an instrumental oriented band. So if you're going to listen to these records, come into that with mind. I took a few more notes on Paranoid than I did on Black Sabbath because Paranoid is a bit more of a fleshed out album, and it was the one I was really looking forward to listening to. At the end of the day, still not my cup of tea, but it was fun to take notes on the song. So the first track on here is called War Pig / Luke's Wall, and I believe Luke's Wall only refers to a little riff at the end. This one feels like a rewrite of Bob Dylan's song Master of War, which says, the rich and the politicians just pointlessly send working class kids out to die, albeit with a different aesthetic, that kind of goth rock sound. I'm even suggesting let's turn the world against war by rather than saying the bad guys are the generals, let's call the generals witches. We're going to use spooky language in our protest song. Track 2 is that one that made me want to fall in love with Black Sabbath, Paranoid. Lyrically, it's quite interesting because while the lyrics are a clear description of someone in mental distress, it doesn't sound like a description of someone facing what one would call paranoia. So one has to ask, I guess, are these lyrics being sung by an unreliable narrator? Is he not telling us the full extent of his problems, even if he's aware of some of them? But the other thing that's great about Paranoid is like the guitar production is just in that perfect place where each note sounds clean and not too heavy, yet it's thick enough that it doesn't sound empty. It has that rock and roll coolness to it while also having a sort of light slickness to it. Again, I'm still early in my experience with Black Sabbath, but I can't imagine they can write a much better song than this. Track number 3 is called Planet Caravan. I thought the lyrics of this one kind of reminded me a bit of Jimi Hendrix's Purple Haze and psychedelic music more broadly. Another Jimi Hendrix song I thought a bit of was the one called Little Wing. This one sounds a bit different than the other Black Sabbath songs in that it's not like heavy music. It's kind of weirdly muffled and sung over what sounds kind of like a drum circle. I guess you could say it's the calm before the storm of the next track. Track 4 is another huge Black Sabbath hit. I guess the only other Black Sabbath song I knew before, which is called Iron Man. I'd never thought about what it's really about before, and the lyrics to Iron Man describe kind of a Frankenstein's monster, and the song kind of gets on the self-fulfilling prophecy theme of if we fear that robots will destroy us, then we will make enemies out of robots, and then they will want to destroy us. I didn't like Iron Man as much as I liked Paranoid, only because I felt like the instrumentals at the end went on a bit too long, and it also just sounded like kind of a random jam. It didn't feel like it was building on the earlier part of the song. Track number 5 is called Electric Funeral. There's some nice reverb on the opening riff of this one that kind of sounds like electric sparks, so good sound effect. But other than that, with the song, I started to sense a pattern where it feels like with a lot of Black Sabbath compositions, it didn't feel like there was much thought put into the melody. It felt more like Ozzy Osbourne would just chant something and then they would play whatever guitar riffs they wanted to play. They didn't really think about how music and lyrics would go together. Can be said that's maybe a bit more positive about the song is that it's contributing to the album having a kind of thematic coherence, right? It's whether intentional or not, this whole album ends up exploring a few key ideas in a focused way. So there's a lyric that goes, robot minds of robotic slaves lead them to atomic graves, plastic fat flowers, melting sun, fading moon falls upon. So it takes the idea of the Iron Man and says, this isn't a one-time thing. This is something that our civilization is going to keep producing again and again. Track number 6 is called Hand of Doom. This one sends the message that this is not just supposed to be a concept album about, spooky imagery, that it's trying to say something about our real world, as there's a part that goes, first it was the bomb, Vietnam napalm, disillusioning. You push the needle in, taking us away again from witches and robots and saying, no, there are these scary monsters who are soldiers. Track number 7 is an instrumental called Rat Salad. I didn't look up where this title came from, though I guess you could sort of imagine the little riff on it sounding like the syllables rat salad. It's short and sweet. And then track number 8 is called Fairies Wear Boots slash Jack the Stripper. Lyrically, I found this song kind of wraps up the album in a kind of reassuring way. For once, this album's psychedelic imagery is allowed to not be terrifying, as the singer is consulting a doctor. It feels like what the doctor is doing here is saying, son, you've said a lot of delusional things. You're tripping. You got to get back under control. You're not actually seeing fairies dancing around in boots. Musically, it's one of the more adventurous songs on here with little different instrumental parts, one of which reminded me of Paul McCartney and Wings' Band on the Run. So I don't know, it's a bit of a weird song, but lyrically it serves a purpose. So Black Sabbath, probably not the right band for me, but I can certainly enjoy the aesthetic of their music when playing it in the background, and I can certainly appreciate the significance of Paranoid and Iron Man as important rock and roll compositions. I guess I'll in the future try and find a kind of goth rocky band that does allow their vocalist to be a bit more of the focus, because again, I was expecting Ozzy Osbourne to be this larger than life character, but oftentimes his vocals are kind of suppressed in the mix, or they're long bits without vocals, or the vocals don't really have a melody to them because the focus is on the instrumental riffs. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.